Why are you depressed? Why are you not able to focus or unable to sleep? And it can be so many different things, and often it's a combination, but it can be blood sugar, it can be inflammation, it can be something out of balance in your gut flora or your gut lining.
What are some things that people can do every day that can help alleviate symptoms of anxiety, depression, etc.?
Yeah, so that's the point of the book. There's a lot that we can do, and there's no gatekeeping to it. It's not something where you have to go see somebody inaccessible, expensive, where there's a stigma barrier or a long wait list. You can start today. You can keep your blood sugar stable. Something as simple as that can eradicate a lot of unnecessary anxiety. Because a lot of times what happens is when our blood sugar crashes, our body responds with stress response. And then that gets the job done. It signals to our liver to break down our storage of glycogen, which is starch, into blood sugar. And then we have blood sugar restored in our body. But as a sort of collateral damage, we're also now in a 5-alarm fire stress response. And that feels synonymous with anxiety and panic. And we're walking around all day long on this blood sugar roller coaster because the modern American diet is refined carbohydrates and coffee drinks that are secretly milkshakes and rosé all day. So we're all on this roller coaster. And a lot of us are just, our blood sugar is crashing and we're anxious. And we think of ourselves, we identify as anxious. And we think it's something that requires meds or 7 years on the couch with a therapist, when in fact, just keeping our blood sugar stable can get us a lot of the way there. Something as simple as getting better sleep, which isn't completely simple, but that's something where, anybody who's familiar with your work, there's a lot of strategies that we can do. Some of them are not intuitive. So, most of us went much of our lives getting exposure to blue spectrum light after sunset, because that's modern life. We have the overhead light on, we have the TV screen on, we share the couch with a laptop, there's a spreadsheet open, we're answering emails from bed and scrolling TikTok until 11 p.m. And that just feels benign because everyone's doing it. But our poor little brains were evolved on the sort of proverbial savanna of evolution where we had no choice but to have darkness after sunset. So that's the design of the body, is to use that as syncing up our whole sleep-wake cycle or our circadian rhythm. And so when we mess with that and we start to get blue spectrum light after sunset, our brain thinks, okay, good morning. It's 8 a.m. The sun is rising, even if it's 11 p.m. And then we're not falling asleep easily. We're not staying asleep deeply. And we feel anxious the next day because our brain really didn't get to reset. The lymphatic system didn't get to clear out waste products, and nothing's working right the next day. We feel anxious. And it could have been something as simple as having blue blocking glasses on, putting the phone down a little bit earlier, getting to bed a little bit earlier, and getting a good night's sleep.
Wow. It's like we're living perennially as if we are navigating like the Vegas catacombs, like the shopping malls of Vegas, right? That are purposefully designed so as not to indicate what time of day it is.
Yeah.
And so our brains constantly are living in that sort of state.
Well, we live in the attention economy, right? Our attention is the commodity these days that's being competed for by really smart companies. So of course, what they're doing is they're thinking like, well, how do we keep your eyeballs on our product? And there's two main ways to go about that. You can give us a hit of dopamine, especially if it's that unpredictable interval reward, like the way a slot machine works. If sometimes you get this many likes, but sometimes you get this many likes, then, and TikTok's very good at this, sometimes you get a huge bump in people seeing your videos, your content. That really makes our brain light up, and we're anticipating that reward again, and we stay glued. The other thing is preying on our fear response. Anything that instills fear or uncertainty or doubt will really make us stay tuned. We'll rubberneck if there's controversy. These things make us glued to it. And so they win, they get more viewership, they get more clicks, more ad revenue. But our mental health is the collateral damage. And we're just glued to social media, and we don't even realize that we're in the Vegas catacombs and it's 11 p.m. And that rewarding, addictive social media app is screwing with our circadian rhythm so that we can't fall asleep. We don't even get tired.
Wow. And on social media, there's also like, in terms of the algorithm, there's a negativity bias.
Yes.
Which is, I think, pretty problematic.
It's its own direct line to anxiety.
Yeah.
The fact that right now controversy gets more traction. So if you're out there saying like, here's a peaceful message to help you feel a little bit less anxious, let's spread love, let's spread peace. Like people may be like, well, that's kind of nice.
It gets ignored.
Yeah. But if it's like, here's a super controversial thought on the thing of the moment, and then everyone piles on and it's tribal warfare in the comments section, and all Instagram knows to think is like, this one's resonating. And so we're bathed in these waters where we think everything is contentious. Everyone is at war with each other, and we're never bridging those gaps. Our We already had a hyperpolarization going on. It's gotten even more intense in the last couple of years. And so right now, we're just really at a loss of compassion, understanding, forming those bridges where we understand each other's perspectives. And social media, I do think, plays into that.
It's like because the people behind the velvet rope, behind the curtain that are designing these apps, it's not like they're consulting with psychiatrists, wondering what's going to be the algorithm that is most promotive of good mental health.
Mm.
These algorithms are specifically designed to keep people glued to the screens, increase engagement, diminish the probability that somebody's going to swipe out of the app,
Yeah.
and yeah, it's like where is the conversation? I mean, in Silicon Valley that needs to be had with people that truly understand mental health and what these algorithms are doing to our mental health.
I sometimes worry that they actually are consulting with behavioral psychologists, neuroscientists, people who understand these effects, but are sort of fighting for the dark side.
Oh no.
I wonder.
Yeah, no, I think you're probably right. I want to talk a little bit about diet because that's what you mentioned off the bat, the blood sugar roller coaster that most of us seem to be on. Most people start their days with highly refined carbohydrates, whether it's commercial cereal, then they throw on top of that the glass of, fruit juice,
It's part of a balanced breakfast.
part of a balanced breakfast. I was in a supermarket the other day and I was looking at a box of Honey Nut Cheerios, and the health claims are so big and bold, and the actual cereal is served in a heart-shaped bowl
Mhm.
on the box of cereal. You would almost be inclined to think that this is like not the trash that it actually is.
Yeah.
But that's how most people are starting their days. So what does that do? From the standpoint of anxiety, you kind of alluded to the fact that it's certainly not helping. But let's unpack that idea a little bit.
It's really tricky because say you're listening to this right now or watching it and you're anxious. So we're about to go do what we do, which is like tear apart the modern food environment. And it can be really overwhelming and it can make people anxious to be like, wait, I'm doing everything wrong and I can't trust that heart-shaped thing on the package. And now I have to be orthorexic and obsessive about my food. So there's a balance here. But yeah, I mean, I think that um, marketing is good at what it does, and you kind of have to know. You have to have a spidey sense for any time somebody is trying to sell you something. So if they're trying to sell you something. In general, smart companies have figured out, well, something addictive is going to do better. So whether that's sugar or video games or social media or tobacco or caffeine or alcohol or a number of other things, like these are the successful companies. And so if it has the primary spot, that like prime spot on the supermarket shelf, and it's got all the shiny letters and everything, like be skeptical. That's a very effective company being effective at what they do, which is probably something that's stable and addictive and not doing your body any good. And a lot of the healthiest foods are extremely inefficient. They don't work on a grand scale. We have to get a little bit simpler and smaller, and it's more work. And that's really tricky. And we're all trying to hack that and figure that out in our lives. How do you eat well in a way that's not its own part time job? But so I think that we do just want people to be able to approach the supermarket with skepticism, with an eye towards discerning what's a yearning that your body has for something that your body needs versus a yearning for a drug. And I think that's like the ultimate discerning is figuring out like, okay, I'm craving a steak and a pile of potatoes. In my book, the compass I'll always use is it a real food?
Hmm.
Is that a real food? Like, did it come from a healthy animal or did it grow in the ground? It's generally a real food. And if you're craving a real food, no shame about it. Don't overthink it. Kind of try to honor what your body's asking for. But if you're craving, your body's like, you know what, my deep inner wisdom is that I think I need to have a pizza right now. It's probably a craving for the drug-like effects of pizza. That, it has casomorphin in the cheese and gluteomorphin in the wheat, and it has sugar, and who knows how pizza comes together to be the perfect crack cocaine, but somehow it does. And so you just have to discern. It's not to say it's always the wrong choice to have the pizza. You just want to know. You want to go into it eyes wide open and make a conscious decision of right now, the radical act of self love is to eat the pizza. Or right now, the radical act of self love is to not eat the pizza. And the foods that our body is really yearning tend to not have a hangover. So if the
Hmm.
radical act of self-love in the moment is to eat the thing, like the gelato, the pizza, you're not really going to have an emotional hangover from it afterward. It's just going to be a sort of the act of enjoying this human experience and indulging for a moment.
Yeah. So, because sometimes eating a slice of pizza is giving yourself a gift in a way.
Absolutely.
Whether or not it's good for the body, it can play a role in mental health if you're eating a pizza, but you're mindful of the fact and you're present with the food and you're enjoying it.
And there's that fine line between like always doing what's right for the body can sometimes strip our lives of joy and ease.
And you got to do what's right by the soul as well.
That's right. And so, like, I mean, I'll be maybe 85% of the time doing what's right by the body, and 15% of the time it's the pizza. And to me, that overall feels like what's right for the body because ease is also medicine.
Hmm.
Joy, pleasure, it's all medicine. It's just really tricky because some people, there's less wiggle room. Like, if you're on that upward trajectory of your healing path and your body's inflamed, your digestion is all off, you're celiac, something's really not working. It might not be 15% wiggle room. It might be a little bit less. Whereas if you're in more of a maintenance mode, you've done a lot of healing, you're in a good place, then there is more leeway.
I love that. So, for somebody prone to anxiety, what would you say then is a good way to start the day food wise?
Okay. So I am somewhat agnostic. I think I've certainly I'm open to the whole case to be made around refined carbohydrates are going to just start you on. You're going to load, board that blood sugar roller coaster, and then you'll be on it the rest of the day. But if my patient wants to have a smoothie or wants to have sausage or eggs or sauteed spinach, I think that's all good. If they want to do intermittent fasting, that's a conversation. I tend to see in my practice more men doing really well with that. Women of reproductive age, it's a deeper conversation, whether it works for their body. And I mean, I hate to admit it, but I eat oatmeal, like a very doctored up oatmeal, and it's definitely it's not a refined carbohydrate, but it is a bit of a carb bomb, but it does work for my body, and I've kind of tested all the different scenarios, and that's actually a workable solution for me.
But even among oatmeals, there are
Mm,
types that are more refined and
yeah,
there are types that are less refined. So, can you walk us through maybe the different kinds of oatmeal and
sure.
the kind that you choose?
We're going deep on oatmeal. So I think optimal is probably like a certified gluten-free steel cut oats that you're making in like a pressure cooker overnight or in a rice cooker. I often just in a lazy way will do that gluten-free quick cooking oats like Bob's Red Mill. And I think that we want to be aware that the like Quaker oats that you might find in a conventional grocery store that's probably gonna be milled in the same equipment as flour, and so if you are trying to eat gluten-free, and you're eating oats because 'cause you're like, "Oats don't have gluten," but they do because they're kind of coated in the flour that is happening on this machinery. So, I've had many a patient think that they're putting in all this effort to be gluten-free, and they weren't seeing any improvement, and rather than be convinced that gluten didn't matter to their health, since I'm such a
Hmm.
broken record on that one, I'm usually investigating where are the hidden sources of gluten in their diet, and often oats is a culprit.
Hmm. Interesting. Yeah, and glutes have glutes. Glutes are great.
It's a muscle, it's a
Um,
kind of person.
Different conversation. Uh, oats are great in the sense that they have beta glucans, right? In my brain, I was combining oats and beta glucans, and they came
Mhm.
out as anyway.
I see.
But yeah, so immunomodulatory beta glucans, which I think are really helpful, and they have that viscous gel forming soluble fiber, which we know
Yeah,
can be really good for balancing lipids
right.
and hormones and the like.
That's right. And then you can doctor up in useful ways. So I'll add frozen blueberries, I add shelled hemp seed, I'll add pecan pieces, and sort of depending on what's going on in my kitchen, always cinnamon, sometimes like a little bit of ghee, something like that.
Why always cinnamon?
Oh, for the flavor.
Oh, for the
Yeah,
flavor.
yeah, I mean, yeah, the blah, 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 diabetes effects, but really for the flavor.
It does. Cinnamon does have anti-hyperglycemic effects,
Yeah,
though, doesn't
yeah,
it?
it does.
Always a smart choice to add cinnamon to something high in starch.
Add it to everything,
Add it to
put
everything.
it on your pizza.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And that keeps you pretty sated through to lunch, would you say? So that it does a good job in terms of keeping you full.
So, it does a good job keeping me full, but I'm at a phase where I've done a lot of repair work around the blood sugar roller coasters that I
Mm.
ride on. So, for my patients who for it doesn't, then we're gonna think about, like, a more protein, fat-based breakfast, and not go straight to carbohydrates first thing in the morning.
Got it. Okay, so for somebody that is prone to anxiety, oats, maybe you want to steer towards a food that's higher in protein,
Yeah. I
higher in
mean,
fiber, healthy
so
fats.
I think that your listeners are pretty, like, they've got their PhD in this at this point. But for anybody who's not aware of this, one most basic tenet is that the 90s did us wrong and convinced us that we should somehow be eating low fat. And that has really not helped us. I think it's contributed to the diabetes epidemic and certainly to the epidemic levels of anxiety.
Mm.
So, even if you can kind of intellectually grasp, okay, fat is no longer maligned, you do have to start to, in a felt sense, embrace it. So we see like that fatty sausage sizzling on the pan, and many of us still have something that gets tripped in our brain that's like, ooh, heart attack, not healthy. And so you kind of have to rectify that and realize like that's actually a really wonderful blood sugar stabilizing way to start the day. A little bit of sauteed spinach, sauteed in the grease from the sausage. Maybe you're having a little bit of potatoes at that point if you're going to have a starch, but you could keep it just to veggies and meat with fat. And that's a wonderful way to start the day so that you're starting with um, all of that nutrition and then also something that's not putting you on the roller coaster.
Hmm. A lot of people start their day with coffee.
Hmm.
Um, where does caffeine play into anxiety?
Yeah. So there are plenty of people listening right now who have a wonderful relationship to something like Bulletproof coffee, adding maybe ghee or butter or MCT oil to their coffee. Great. Maybe it plays a role in their intermittent fasting. Great, great, great. For anybody who's reading my book about anxiety, I tend to think that caffeine is at least worth reconsidering. And there's nothing inherently bad about coffee. Coffee is a wonderful substance full of magnesium, antioxidants. It's this ritual that gives us joy, and it's sometimes our one true friend in the world. Um, but if you are prone to anxiety, we're just also different, and we have to get real about bioindividuality. Some of us are rapid metabolizers of caffeine. You could have your espresso at the end of dinner and no problem, you go to bed. And some of us are slow metabolizers of caffeine. I know for me, if I have coffee in the morning, I'm effectively on caffeine or I'm effectively on cocaine that day and like not sleeping for the next week.
Hmm.
So I'm a very slow metabolizer. It makes me kind of shaky. It really jacks up my nervous system. And so I've had to get honest with myself and go off of it slowly over time. So if you're someone who thrives on caffeine, that's great. And if you are someone who, of course, you drink coffee because you're addicted to coffee, but also, of course, you're anxious and you always feel sort of on edge, your nerves are frayed, you're tremulous, you're just wired, like feeling that hopped up feeling, it might be worth looking at the role that caffeine is playing in that. And I'll just point out one thing, which is that part of the reason we love coffee and caffeine so much is that it gets credit for being the antidote to its own withdrawal.
Mm.
So once you're on caffeine, you're effectively, you're physiologically dependent on caffeine. And you wake up in the morning feeling like this car that won't start. And then you have your coffee and everything feels better. And so we're like, coffee, that's the good stuff. And we give it credit. But the reason it feels so good is that the best feeling in the world is scratching the itch of withdrawal with the withdrawn substance itself. Like ask anyone who's ever withdrawn from heroin, from benzodiazepines. Same goes with caffeine. It's milder, it's not a deadly withdrawal, but it feels really good to drink caffeine when you're in caffeine withdrawal, which many of us wake up in. And so part of the reason we love it is that it is just treating its own withdrawal. And there is a journey that can be had where you get out of that physiologic dependency on caffeine. I recommend going gradually. Otherwise, you'll be irritable and tired and cranky and headachy.
Hmm.
But if you can slowly taper off over the course of several weeks, then you might find yourself at a new normal in terms of your anxiety levels.
I love that advice, and I would co-sign on that in a heartbeat because I love caffeine. I love coffee. I love the way it tastes. And for many, many years, I was a consistent morning coffee drinker. I love the ritual. I love the way that it made me feel. But you're right. I noticed at a certain point that I was just treating my withdrawal from the previous day, from the 24-hour lack of caffeine, and um, and that it's never a free. It's like not a free ride. It's not free energy that it
Yeah.
just creates from nowhere. You're
Yeah.
basically borrowing energy from later, and that debt is going to be repaid usually in the afternoon,
Yeah.
where you feel usually compelled to drink more caffeine, which is only going to screw with your sleep, especially for slow metabolizers. So over the past year, I've really been diligent about removing caffeine, doing like like creating a more cyclic relationship with it, where I'll cut it out. I'll go caffeine free for a few months, and then I'll slowly begin to taper it back in. And then what I notice is that when I do finally have that like cup of actual coffee, because I'll drink decaf during that time usually, uh, just because again I like the taste. But when I do finally have that cup of regular coffee, it feels like euphoric. You feel why you understand why it's the most popular beverage in the world
Yeah.
because it's like a drug,
Hmm.
and so you get this like euphoric hit. But yeah, the drinking of it every single day, I think, can be problematic.
Yeah, I agree. That's exactly my protocol as well, is to rely on it actually as somewhat of a performance enhancing substance, but
Mm,
I reserve it like for very special occasions, honestly, like dance parties. It's like
yeah.
if I want to stay up late and dance, but actually music behaves like caffeine to my body. But I think that, it's these rare occasions, it's more like a couple times a year rather than daily. And you actually get you get more revved up from it when you're not acclimated and tolerant of it.
You came into the studio with a packet of lion's mane.
Oh, it's embarrassing. Yeah. Yeah. This is not coffee.
It's not coffee. It's lion's mane. Is that something? Tell me about lion's mane and your relationship with that. Why is that something that you chose to drink before recording?
I'm sure you know more about it than I do, but basically, it's one of these medicinal mushrooms that I think it basically helps cerebral blood flow. And so I find that it helps me think a little bit more clearly. And yeah, I've noticed that that's helpful in a podcast when you want to be so on point.
I like that. I mean, whether it actually is or you're just getting a placebo from it, I mean, it doesn't really matter, right?
Hmm.
At the end of the day.
Yeah, a safe placebo is more power to you.
Yeah.
That's part of my concern with some aspects of conventional psychiatry is that, when we think can we go there into sort of controversial conversation about medication?
Yeah.
It's such a sensitive topic because I'm a psychiatrist. I prescribe medication. I have patients who benefit from it. I'll put people on antidepressants, and I see people benefit from it so often. But I've also seen all these other scenarios play out. Sometimes it's somebody who benefited initially, and then the effect wanes, or I'll see somebody who never really benefited, feels like they've tried everything. Some people need to get off of it for other reasons. Maybe it's contraindication with another medication they're taking or family planning considerations, and whatever the case may be. It's not necessarily a benign substance. And sometimes we have some evidence now to suggest the fact that for severe depression, antidepressants are fairly effective. For mild to moderate depression, it doesn't necessarily separate from placebo, which is interesting because placebo is actually nothing to sneeze at. It's also a fairly robust benefit, it does fade over time. And when I meet a patient and I want them to feel better, I just want them to feel better. And so, you know, I will sometimes think about leveraging that
Hmm.
potential placebo effect, but it's not a benign placebo. And that's always where you need to be careful, right? Like
Hmm.
a benign placebo, like if lion's mane is not actually increasing cerebral blood flow, but I think it is, great. But if I tried to get off of my lion's mane habit and it left me irritable or unable to sleep or suddenly precipitously depressed, that's where I'm concerned. And so I think like we're in a moment right now where we're throwing medicines around. We're throwing SSRIs around. We're throwing medicinal mushrooms and adaptogens around. Psychedelics are thrown around right now. And all of these things are powerful medicines that I think we should be leveraging. But we also want to be so careful and just so conscious about how we're thinking about potential long term consequences.
Is it not true that 1 in 4 women over the age of 40 are on some kind of psychiatric drug?
That's correct. Antidepressants specifically. Yeah.
That's insane to me.
Yeah. Yeah. To me, this is like at the heart of my fundamental view of mental health, which is that we have all come of age indoctrinated with the idea that mental health is a genetic chemical imbalance, it's somewhat of a destiny, and it's corrected with a pill. And that could be true, but it doesn't make sense to my ancestral understanding of human health. And I think about, like, I don't think the human body is designed all that poorly, and that 1 in 4 of us would be depressed. So I think about it as when I see someone depressed, what I'm first thinking is what are potential root causes? In what way is this actually the body communicating some state of imbalance rather than the body communicating, I was genetically destined to be depressed. This is just me. This is just my depression. Like, depression is not the end. Like, we're so fixated on diagnoses. And we're like, oh, I got the diagnosis. Now I know what I am. I'm depressed and I have ADHD and insomnia. It's like that actually didn't answer anything. That tells us how we're characterizing your symptoms. But to me, I'm always interested in what's the root. Why are you depressed? Why are you not able to focus or unable to sleep? And it can be so many different things. And often it's a combination, but it can be blood sugar, it can be inflammation, it can be something out of balance in your gut flora or your gut lining. It can be a micronutrient deficiency, it can be thyroid dysfunction, it can be sort of related to other autoimmune diseases. And then there's this whole other aspect of life, which is that it can have nothing to do with our physical health. I love looking at physical health. I think that's an underappreciated aspect of mental health, is to recognize that the brain is just a piece of flesh in the body like anything else, and anything that gets our body out of balance impacts our brain and therefore impacts our mental health. But sometimes our mental health is not physical and it's somewhat psychospiritual.
Hmm.
And we might be perfectly in physical balance. We might be eating perfectly and getting exactly the right amount of exercise and sleep and sunshine, but we have these fundamental human needs for community, good relationships, and meaningful work and purpose and some connection to, you know, some sense of awe of what this is that we're experiencing. And I think also some relationship to nature. And when we're not getting those needs met, we can do everything perfectly physically and we're still not feeling well. So when I meet somebody who's depressed, the last thing I'm thinking is like, this is a Lexapro deficiency disorder.
Hmm.
I'm thinking about all of these other contributors and determinants of mental health.
So, I mean, then as a physician, like, where do you even begin to like diagnose like the root cause of their problem? Like, do you have them start journaling? Do you take like a record of their diet? Do you have them track their, I don't know, their diet, their exercise routine, their sleep habits? Do you put, slap sleep trackers on them? Do you interview their friends and family? Like where do you even begin?
I wish I could get all of that data, but at this point, the longer I do this, the more of the sort of paraphernalia I have stripped away. Like I used to do more lab testing. At this point, a 2-hour conversation can get me a lot of the information I need to know where to start with somebody. And, we're looking at, well, what's your sleep like? And what's your family history? And what's your trauma history? And are you pooping? And if not, like, what does it look like?
Hmm.
And I want to know about somebody's energy. If it's a woman of reproductive age, I want to know about her cycle. And then, psychiatrists are, it's a beautiful aspect of our training is to kind of like read the micro expressions, read the eye saccades, the body language, and kind of that's also how you kind of learn where's the money. Like you see where someone has resistance to talking about something, or where they have a reaction, almost like a lie detector test would pick it up. You see their nervous system mobilize in response to a certain topic, and usually that means gently and judiciously you want to kind of peel back some layers there.
So interesting. I love that. Almost like, so where does the line then um lie between you and like how a therapist might treat like a patient? Like what, it seems like there's a lot of talking that goes on.
Yeah. So, I mean, there's so many different ways to do this kind of work, and there's even so many different ways to be a therapist. I am, at the sort of a crossroads of a few different disciplines. I'm a psychiatrist, which really means I was trained to be like a medication, manager, like to basically have 15-minute sessions where I was like, everything okay with the Adderall? Oh, you want to increase the dose? Okay. That's what I was trained to do. And that's not what I do.
Wow.
But, I'm a therapist. I'm also a functional medicine practitioner. And then at this point, I sort of jokingly refer to myself as a witch, but I'm doing a lot of energy work and sort of understanding things on a more psychospiritual level. And in many ways, I find myself quarterbacking and making sure that if indicated, if someone needs to pursue psychedelic therapy in some way, I'm pointing them in the right direction.
Yeah, that's I first discovered your work at a conference and you were talking about psychedelic assisted psychotherapy, and you were so articulate on the subject that I knew that I had to, be in your orbit. Is that something that you routinely use?
Yeah. Yeah. So I don't facilitate anything directly, but I always now, and this is going to sound like very magical thinking for somebody who isn't already sort of in that world. But I feel like once I started to work with those kinds of medicines, I get, I feel a strong sense of, um, I know when it's the right time to bring it up with a patient.
Hmm.
I made a couple missed calls on that, but usually it feels like actually that was the right moment to point them in that direction. So For some of my patients, they're maybe working with ketamine at a ketamine clinic. Some of my patients are going to the Amazon and working with ayahuasca. Some of my patients find their way to underground practitioners to do facilitated psilocybin experiences. But it's been completely life affirming to see that work in practice. And it's not for everyone. It's not for all indications. It's not for all the time. Like there's so many caveats to it. But we would be remiss if we didn't also recognize that it's absolutely paradigm shifting in terms of our ability to help people get well when it comes to their mental health.
Absolutely. It's like real, and there's real science backing this practice now from Hopkins, from NYU.
Yep.
It's super exciting.
Yeah. UCLA and universities all around the world at this point. Yeah.
Amazing. So we've talked about anxiety and diet. We've talked about anxiety and sleep. What about depression? First of all, how does anxiety present differently from depression?
For me, this comes down quite a bit. Like I've really at this point thrown away my DSM, the book that we're trained to use, the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual that psychiatrists and therapists use to diagnose. I've realized that that is there to like give people that feeling of, oh, I have a diagnosis. Now I understand what I have, as if. And I think what it really does is just take a collection of symptoms and say, well, if you meet in somewhat arbitrary ways, like if you meet 7 out of 10 criteria, then you qualify. And I understand the desire to gatekeep certain diagnoses, but the only thing here that we really need to gatekeep is medication. And I don't do a lot of prescribing of medication, so I don't really need to gatekeep. So when someone comes to me and says that they are having a subjective experience of anxiety or of depression, to me, it's a little bit like, okay, game over. Like I know what we're working with here. Sometimes I'll be like, oh, I didn't, this patient is not identifying as bipolar or whatever it is, but I'm seeing this pattern. But it's not really the diagnosis is not the end of the discussion. It's really the beginning of the inquiry. So when someone is saying, I'm subjectively feeling anxious, I'm subjectively worried all the time, or feeling tense, or I can never relax, or I'm always in this state of panic or dread, or anticipating negative outcomes, anticipating the future. That's how it's presenting. And I'm always thinking first about things like blood sugar, caffeine, alcohol, but then the basics, also inflammation, also sleep, also exercise, et cetera, et cetera. Depression does present a little bit differently. There's tons of overlap. Plenty of people just toggle between the two states all day, every day. But sometimes what you'll see in depression is a real lack of vitality.
Hmm.
You'll see someone sort of almost pitted out. And I'm also thinking physiologically about that. Is it a micronutrient deficiency? Is it a thyroid issue? Are they not getting good sleep? Are they just too connected to devices? Like, is the phone just sucking their energy away? But I'm also always going straight to a psychospiritual question there. Is if somebody doesn't feel affirmed by this human experience, even when it has challenge, even when it has suffering, when someone is sort of feeling like, what's the point? Um, to me, there's something in their experience that's like, there's been some big betrayal. There's been some big turn off of a trajectory that's like, I'm not saying this well. I'll see someone who I think at some point got off their path.
Hmm. When you said that there's been a betrayal, I mean that hit for me. I mean, it doesn't have to be a betrayal in the sense of somebody having lied to you. It can be maybe you've betrayed yourself in some
Exactly.
way.
Most of the time it's that. Yeah.
Wow.
And there's no blame here, right? It's that we're raised in this world. It gives us a certain, we all get our conditioning. Women are conditioned in one way and men in some way, and someone who doesn't identify in either, binary, it's an even more complicated set of conditioning. But basically, we learn how we're expected to comport ourselves in this world. And for many of us, we're systematically trained to deny some kind of inner truth. And so I think depression can sometimes mm, sort of indicate that under the surface is someone who's out of connection with their truth. And so, in many ways, it involves stripping away the conditioning, stripping away all the shoulds and all the ways that we are behaving in a way that's falling into the expectations that are put on us, and getting back to, well, here's what actually lights me up. Here's what feels meaningful to me. Here's how much rest I need. And here's how much nature I need. And here's how much community I need. And here's my sacred no, in all of these ways that we kind of get trained to like do it all opposite of what our inner self is crying for.
Yeah, but I feel like especially when you're depressed, the outside world can seem extremely overwhelming. So what should people do then? Like what are like some of the first steps that people should take to get out of that rut?
Mm. Mm. It's not always an easy solution, but there's certain things I think you can never go wrong. I think nature is very powerful, and we all say it. It's a cliche. We know to say that, like, oh, nature's healing and it's medicine, but like, actually, just fucking do it, right?
Mm,
It's like it doesn't have to be grand. If you can go on a little hike, go on a little hike. But if all you have access to is to walk down the street and be in the park for 10 minutes, then do that and make it hippie. Like, take off your socks and shoes, or exchange ions with the earth. That's a benign placebo that I think is very effective. It's like
mm.
having some actual physical tactile connection to the literal earth. And
Grounding.
grounding, yeah. So, or earthing, people call it different things, and forest bathing. All of this is a powerful practice. And so, if everything's feeling overwhelming, you feel like you don't even know which way is up. Um, there's a there's a way that nature can sync up with our breath, ease our nervous system, and also make things seem a little bit more simple and purposeful. And also, it gives us that perspective of how small we are and how awe-inspiring this world is. So that's helpful. And I think community is helpful, but that one is fraught with issues.
Mm.
And so I think this is one of the fundamental problems with modern life is how much we're not living in community. Social media plays an interesting, complicated role here in certain ways connecting us to our people, and in certain ways just creating an opportunity cost where we're sucked into our phones and not interacting with people physically present in the room. But basically, figuring out how to have authentic, goofy, fun, real, present community. And that's tricky. But I think that if you build it, they will come. And even if no one is inviting you to the perfect bowling night or the perfect, like, we'll sit around and talk about this, like, whatever will light you up, you create that and you invite people. Some people will say yes or no. It's a good filter because whoever says no, it's probably not the right community for you. And whoever's down for it, it's a start.
Yeah, sometimes I think that like it's fun to just plan like a date night with yourself.
Hmm.
You ever do that? Like you just like plan for a movie that you really want to see, or maybe it's like a series that you've been really, hoping to start. Cook yourself a really healthy meal, set like a vibe for yourself, put on like your favorite music. I do this sometimes. I got, I'll if there's nothing appealing to me in like outside, if none of my friends are going out, or if I even feel like going out, but nobody's available for me and I'm just left to my own devices, I'll put on some like vibey music in my house. I'll either order up or cook myself a super healthy dinner, and I'll just create like an environment that makes me feel good.
Yeah.
And then I'll watch like a movie or something, and then I'll go to bed and I'll wake up the next morning intending on going to the gym early. Like I'll have it all mapped out in my head, and it makes me feel great.
Yeah. That's a radical act of self love right there.
Maybe like I'm not like a huge bath person, but like have a bath, light some candles.
Yep. I have a little portable infrared sauna. Like, that's the ultimate date night for myself. It's like
Yeah, do it.
a little binders and an infrared sauna. Luxury.
Well, we talk a lot on this podcast about body autonomy, but what about like spiritual autonomy and
Yeah.
emotional autonomy? I think
Yeah.
that's super important. It's not a topic that we talk about enough.
I think we're in an interesting moment with spiritual autonomy. And we have maybe like two broad categories of people right now. We have people who grew up with some kind of organized religion, and then people who grew up basically in a secular, non-religious home. And I think a lot of people who had religion forced upon them, many of them have found their way to sort of KonMari that from their life. They felt like that was imposed upon me. That didn't give me the leeway to be a full expression of myself. It didn't feel safe. It didn't feel supportive. Whatever it is, it felt too patriarchal. So people are throwing that out. And then you have people that are sort of like come of age in where atheism is what's celebrated. It's sort of like the scientism. It's basically saying skepticism is the virtue. Don't be silly and like believe in something. That's something you hear about on the country music station before you quickly turn the dial.
Mm.
And so I think both of these groups of people, at least when it comes to anxiety and depression, I think that there's something to be said for at least being open to the question of, is there some relationship to something broadly called spirituality that feels good and true for you? And there's no need here. Like, I certainly don't have the answers. I'm not here to say I know what the truth is. We'll find out, when we die and we go to the room and they're like, here was the answer all along. And, if there is no room, then there's our answer. But I think that for many of us, we have to make it safe and give ourselves permission to explore spirituality. And, if you grew up in scientism, atheism is a virtue, it can feel dangerous to believe. You can feel silly, you can feel vulnerable with that mindset. If you grew up with organized religion, it can sort of stir up trauma associations. But I encourage people to at least just explore, where do you feel some sense of awe? And it could be in nature, it could be in church, it could be in physics class, it could be like sitting around your living room playing the guitar, having a sing along, but somewhere where you feel like wow, this human experience is somewhat magical.
Mm.
And I think that that ends up being an important salve for anxiety. And I'm not saying you can not be anxious and not have a connection to spirituality, but it's a path worth exploring. And I think spiritual autonomy for me conjures up this idea of, it doesn't have to look like what anybody told us it should look like. It's just what feels true to you.
Couldn't agree more. I think we absolutely need to uncouple the idea of spirituality from religion, because you can be devoutly religious and not spiritual at all,
Hmm.
and you can be very spiritual and not religious in any sense. I mean, the latter is how I would describe myself. I think I have spiritual um, leanings, and beliefs, and feelings occasionally,
Hmm.
um, but they're not religious in any sense. Like, I don't believe in some anthropomorphized man in the sky. But I was in Hawaii around New Year's, and there's very little pollution, very little light pollution. You could see the stars, like you could almost see nebulas. Like, it was the nights were that clear. And for me, just looking up at the stars is a spiritual experience. I mean, you feel so it makes you feel so small, but then at once so large, because you feel like here you are connected to not just everybody else, right? But like everybody who's been. You see this sort of telescoping effect of time and space, and yeah, to me, there's no. I mean, that's not something that religion has ever been able to offer me. It's just something that you feel
Yeah.
in the moment.
This is exactly where I'm arriving at these days. And I grew up in that atheism version where, like, what was around me and what was cool was to be atheist, to be skeptical, to basically like worship at the altar of science and facts and
Mm,
objective reasoning. And I think I, in particular, sort of intuited that men had more power, and there seemed to be this thing about women being irrational and sensitive and men being objective and emotionally even. And I was like, it is safer to have that masculine quality. Like, that's how I will be accepted in the boys club, that's how I will succeed in the workplace. And so I kind of kept molding myself into that image and really betraying, and here we are with the betrayal, like betraying these more feminine, more intuitive, more spiritual, and I call it witchy aspects of myself. And by the time I was like about 30, I was in Bali, and it was like chanting and Sanskrit and earthquake, and all together that really awakened me to the fact that, whoa, I have this vital, incredibly important part of myself that's been completely silenced and extinguished. And I really just reopened it. And ever since then, it's given me immense um, comfort, meaning, guidance. And that's all well and good when life is easy and things are going well. And you're like, oh, the universe told me to do this and it all worked out. But it's also been so important to me when things are really not okay. And that's when it's most challenged, this worldview. When I lost my mom, which is something we share, and it's like that was when I came into it with this worldview of sort of trusting and surrendering and feeling like there's something more than what meets the eye in this universe. But then when I really needed to believe that my mom, in some way, shape, or form, continued to exist, or
mm.
like could know my daughter, I really wanted to doubt it, but I chose. It felt like a conscious choice that I made to say, I'm gonna believe that this is possible. And I'm open to the fact that I could be deluded, but it gives me so much comfort. And it actually allows me to continue to have a relationship with my mom, to connect to her every day. She shows up in my dreams. I kind of bring her into the conversation with my daughter. And so this connection to spiritual possibility is certainly an anxiety salve for me, especially in the hard times.
For somebody that struggles to find that spiritual identity, are there any tools that you would suggest? I mean, for me, just to throw my own anecdote into the mix, like nature, whether it's looking up at the stars, as I mentioned, or even like a good hike and seeing the new growth, in the forest juxtaposed with like the dying, decaying material. And that just seeing that to me, I mean, it sounds like almost like a psychedelic experience, but it's not for me. Like it makes me feel, um, it's a reminder. It's like that. It's just like a reminder that like there's more to this experience than meets the eye.
Yeah, I don't want to be like that, like cliche bro is just like, just do psychedelics and you'll find God, But I think that my friend and colleague Will Sue has a good way of saying this, and I'll butcher his quote a little bit, but he basically says psychedelics are not just a tool for healing trauma; they're also a way to make spirituality palatable to a starving Western world.
Hmm.
And to me, like that says it is that I love, I have this like group of friends. They're basically engineers, but they're psychonauts and they do these medicines and they're so staunchly atheist. But then they'll have an encounter with what, for lack of a better word, feels divine to them. And I just love watching them try to reconcile that. And, there aren't answers, but I like for anybody to have a felt ineffable experience with something that we don't have a better way of characterizing other than to call it God. And what you do with that, whatever works for you. But I think that, so I don't necessarily want to say like, well, just go do hard drugs and that's how you'll find God. But I do think that that kind of practice, deep meditation, breath work, for some people, when safe and indicated, psychedelic work, whatever it takes for you to sort of touch it. And then how you integrate that into your worldview is, a personal journey. But all of these different ways can help us at least have an encounter.
Yeah, absolutely. So important. I love that we're having this conversation. And it's actually spirituality, and I'm not the most spiritual person. I think I have like uh, a little bit of it, like enough of it, but I'm always looking um to learn and grow in that sense. And that's something that my therapist like said that I should work on developing as well. Um so
Yeah.
yeah, it is super important from the mental health standpoint.
Yeah, and I think the most important thing here is that you don't have to arrive anywhere. It's just like there's I think a real good quote like live the questions. Like if you just actually just open yourself up to the questions, just to the act of seeking, that alone is a salve for what ails us in terms of our mental health. So it's just to step onto the path and give yourself license to be exploring it.
Yeah. We started the conversation talking about sleep and how important sleep is, which is definitely something that I do want to talk about a little bit more in terms of ways that people can enhance their sleep, because we do know that it plays such a large role in good mental health.
Yeah. Yeah. It's so, I always get a little bit like disgruntled when people in my field, like psychiatrists, will talk about when someone's depressed or anxious and they're not sleeping well. And they'll say, well, the insomnia is a symptom of the depression. And it's like, well, that may well be, but also the depression is a symptom of the lack of quality sleep. And
Mm,
that's an easier entry point. So let's start there.
mm,
I'm always interested in starting with sleep because if you can sleep right, like a lot of things that are out of balance in mental health and physical health, everything in your body starts to work better when you're getting good sleep. And it's not such a hard nut to crack. I think that there are a few scenarios where it's difficult to manage insomnia. I think menopause and perimenopause is tricky. I think shift labor is tricky and worth taking steps to build towards the possibility of not working shifts. I used to work shifts in medical residency and it's brutal. And so to have some kind of exit strategy long term, having like a newborn is a toughie.
I bet.
Jet lag has some solutions, but mostly it's a toughie. But for everybody else, for the most part, we can sleep. And our body wants to sleep, it knows how to sleep. And the fact that we're not sleeping is not some impossible to solve riddle. It's really just you can start with an ancestral perspective of your brain, your body, if you were in any kind of proverbial evolutionary conditions, would be sleeping. So, how do we just make little tweaks to our modern environment that more closely approximate the evolutionary conditions? So, circadian rhythm is always where I start, and that has to do most of all with light. And so It can be just as easy as when you wake up, and like we can talk about how to optimize, like what's the ideal wake up time. But let's just say when you wake up, you instantly get bright light. Ideally, you even step outside and get actual sunlight into your eyeballs for at least a few minutes. And then the real magic happens after sunset. And there's like beginner, intermediate, advanced layers to that. Like, if you want to just install night shift mode on your phone or night mode or, something like Flux on your computer screen, then it's going a little bit more orange, a little dimmer in the evening. It's like no muss, no fuss. This is
Yeah.
like a set it and forget it. Doesn't impact your life negatively, helps a little bit. Doesn't give you my blessing to scroll TikTok until midnight, but it does a little bit. And then orange glasses, like any kind of blue blockers, I think of as the best kind of health intervention. My favorite point on the graph is something that is non-invasive, it's safe, it has a huge potential benefit. And like the squatty potty wins that category every
Hmm.
time, but that's a different conversation. But blue blocking glasses, you put them on and you're just not letting all the blue spectrum light of modern life after sunset disrupt your circadian rhythm. And even if you're going to scroll, which has its own issues, like that's addictive in its own right, but at least then you're not staying inappropriately wakeful because of the blue spectrum light from the phone. And then advanced is like you could go camping, could like cut off electricity after sunset, just have candles. All of this can have an impact. I think many people are very sensitive to light. I think I have a pet theory about people with bipolar disorder. For some people, it's a thyroid issue. That's its own conversation. For some people, it's just an exquisite sensitivity to light. And
Interesting.
and so I think that like people that are very sensitive to light, our modern environment is going to make them more prone to staying up all night, which I think then does a sort of, stretches the rubber band in the brain. And then we have mania and depression in these cycles in the bipolar diathesis, sort of a person predisposed to that.
They could be more sensitive to light.
Yeah, I think
Wow.
so. It's a pet theory. I don't know.
No, super interesting. My bedroom at night, I keep it like completely dark, except for I have a lamp by my bed, and
Hmm.
in that lamp is a red light bulb.
Yeah.
So that's the only light that I have on in my bedroom at night. And then when I go into my bathroom, I keep my lights off. I have a salt rock lamp that I'll use sometimes, but for the most part, I try to get away with as much as I possibly can at night
Yep.
in total darkness.
Yep.
And your eyes adapt; they get better.
Hmm.
Um,
Yep.
I mean, you're really not doing all that much at night anyway. At least I'm not. I'm flossing and brushing my teeth. I don't need it. And I mean, I've been doing that for almost 40 years at this point. So, I can pretty much figure that out under low light conditions. But then in my room, yeah, it's like it's fully dark. I feel like a hunter gatherer.
Yeah. Yeah. That's impressive that you are a consistent flosser for 40 years. I aspire to be. But yeah, I do the squinty shuffle if I have to pee in the middle of the night. Like you just get up and you don't put on any lights. It's little innocuous things like that that people do and think this isn't harmful. But, you can think of like some people go into the bathroom and flick on the light. Some people keep their phone on their bedside table, which comes with a lot of problems. The
Yeah.
temptation to scroll, the doom scrolling right as you're about to dream and you're seeding your unconscious with stressful thoughts and the algorithm that promotes controversy and the blue spectrum light. So if you're like up in the middle of the night and you want to glance at your phone, that little innocent glance at that phone screen is like this little shot of espresso that's just telling it goes through your eyes to the suprachiasmatic nucleus in the brain. And it basically says, the sun just rose, suppress melatonin, release cortisol, wake up, meet the challenges of the day. And so then we toss and turn and we struggle to fall back asleep. Waking up in the middle of the night is a really interesting problem. I think that, there's a conversation to be had around the luteal phase and ovulation around the full moon. That's a conversation. But I think that for the most part, sometimes it's blood sugar, sometimes it's alcohol, and we can kind of talk about that. But often it's just a normal physiologic process called middle sleep, which I think is so poorly named. It's really like middle wake up. But a lot of us have two somewhat symmetrical consolidated blocks of sleep. So if you know you're someone who needs 8 hours of sleep, you'll have two blocks of 4 hours of sleep. So after that first block of 4 hours of sleep, your body will wake up. It might want a sip of water. It might want to pee. It might just want to roll over to the other side. And then within, a couple minutes, 15 minutes, you drop back into sleep. And where we get into trouble is when we start to layer narrative around what's happening.
Mm.
And we're like, oh shit, I'm awake. And oh God, I have an important presentation tomorrow. And now I'm not going to be clear headed for that. And oh no, I'm going to be so tired. And so we start to get all this drama. We look at the phone. We think, oh no, it's 2 a.m. This is bad. And then we're in a stress response and we're tossing and turning, and it's much harder to fall back into sleep. So you actually want to start to remind yourself, this is middle sleep. This is a normal time to wake up. if I lie here in the dark with my eyes closed, maybe do a little progressive muscle relaxation and just don't bring any drama to this, I will be more likely to fall back asleep.
Meditation helps with that
Yeah.
because when your brain, feels the need to go to, oh God, why? I hate waking up in the middle of the night. What do I have to do tomorrow? I've got to wake up so early tomorrow. It's like stress compounding on stress, compounding on stress. Um, but meditation, because it helps you kind of like gracefully volley off of thoughts to go back to the present moment, so too does it help in that middle sleep, I think, phase.
Yeah.
And I wake up many nights in the middle of the night to pee, at this point. And but I've learned that, like, on the job, so to speak,
Yeah.
that you just kind of have to like bring your consciousness back to something that brings you back into the present, which can be your breath, even if you're not a meditator.
Yeah.
Just like focus, as your head hits the pillow again, after peeing or whatever it is, just bring your focus back to your breath,
Yeah. Yeah. My
or how
favorite.
comfortable your bed is or whatever.
Yeah, I often will go there of like, I'll think about what it would mean to be like sleeping on the ground in the cold, in the rain. And then I'm like, oh, how comfortable it is to have a bed and shelter and just appreciate that. I like progressive muscle relaxation where I'll like alternately tense and release muscles of my body progressively starting at the feet, moving up. And you rarely actually make it all the way up. You fall asleep in the middle of that process. So that's also helpful. It has a kind of meditative quality.
Wow, you mentioned blood sugar. Can blood sugar dysregulation cause middle sleep?
Yeah. So, well, I don't think of it as causing middle sleep. I think of it as causing what's called middle insomnia or wake ups throughout the middle of the night.
Got it.
And basically, anyone who gets hangry, who has some indication of like dysglycemia during the day, well, the longest fast that we go through is overnight. That's why we call it break fast. And if you get hangry at 3 in the afternoon, you probably get hangry at 3 in the morning as well.
Mm.
And so then what happens is that same stress response, the blood sugar crashes. Your body says, we can't have that. We need to save our organs. They need blood sugar. So it cues with cortisol and adrenaline to the liver to break down glycogen. And then as a side effect, we are in a stress response. And that stress response, I think of it as like shunting us out of deeper stages of sleep, making our sleep a little more superficial and making us more likely to wake up. Alcohol, which this is not a conversation that I make any friends with, but alcohol, we have to be having so many more like wellness conversations about alcohol because it's been very effectively marketed as heart healthy, as
Mm.
like, the Blue Zones and the Sardinians, they have their wine. And, as we went back to earlier about radical self-love, there are times when that drink can be the act of radical self-love, but we need to be very clear about the fact that it's carcinogenic, it's impacting our mental health, it's impacting our longevity, our brain health. And I think it especially impacts our sleep quality, which then in turn impacts everything else. And the reason this works this way has to do with the fact that alcohol basically rushes our brain with Gaba. And Gaba is this neurotransmitter. It's the primary inhibitory neurotransmitter of the brain. It's the one that tells us, like, shh, you're okay. Everything's going to be okay. And we talk a lot about serotonin. But when it comes to anxiety, Gaba is also really important. And it's the reason we like alcohol is that life feels, tense and we have a lot of worries and we have a lot of tension. And GABA is the antidote to that. And so if we drink or take a benzodiazepine like Klonopin or Xanax, it will wash our brain in GABA and we'll feel like, I don't have a care in the world. This feels good. I'm suddenly confident and at ease. And the problem is, like, that would be great if it were a benign effect. But then the brain, our body in general, doesn't really care about whether or not we're relaxed. It cares about our survival. So it wants to restore homeostasis. And it basically says that's a lot of GABA. So we have a couple options. With the benzodiazepine medications, it starts to board up the GABA receptors, particular
Mm.
receptors called GABA A receptors. And then it's like you don't hear the GABA. So if you have a normal level of GABA after you're not taking the Klonopin anymore, it's like you have less than normal GABA because you're not hearing it properly. With alcohol, it's more like it converts it to another neurotransmitter called glutamate, which is an excitatory neurotransmitter. And that's why in that second half of the night after we've been drinking, we feel on edge, agitated, we're tossing and turning, we're not in deep sleep. And that's the glutamate effect. It also independently impacts our blood sugar. Just to come full circle with that.
Wow. So you become basically like GABA resistant in one of those
Yeah,
scenarios,
exactly.
and then you cause this like flooding effect as your body attempts to return to homeostasis with glutamate.
Yeah. And I think GABA is like this endangered species of modern life because there's so much about modern life that negatively impacts our ability to just have a healthy GABA signaling. Another impact is that if we take antibiotics, if we have dysbiosis in the gut, if we don't have proper balance of gut flora, many of us are missing these particular Bacteroides species that help synthesize GABA.
Mm.
So we're just missing the bacteria that help build up our GABA stores. There's so much about modern life that's making it hard to be relaxed, but there are things we can do to replete it and build it back naturally. But it's the hard stuff, right?
Yeah.
It's like,
Well, exercise has been shown to
mhm,
beautifully help rebalance GABA and
yep.
glutamate.
Exercise is great. Good sleep is great. Actual, like juicy, robust nutrition. All of the different vagal stimulating practices like cold water plunging and cold showers, chanting, pranayama, all breath work, all of this, even acupuncture, craniosacral work, Reiki, all of this can help promote proper GABA signaling.
Wow. So alcohol, just circling back, not good for sleep.
Yeah, I mean, I think that, I know I'm no fun. It's just
Do you
that
drink at all?
I probably have, like, 4 drinks a year,
Hmm.
and, like, 2 of them I regret. But
Wow.
I'm always trying to gauge what is the radical act of self-love.
Yeah.
And, it's, I think that here's the thing is I think we're having a shift on a cultural level, and we have been in this, sort of, state of mind where alcohol really lends itself to the way we were connecting in the past. And I like to believe that we're heading towards a different way of connecting with each other. So, where in the past we might have wanted to numb out or to kind of give ourselves license to be something that the rest of the time we feel too inhibited to be, I think that we might be heading towards a place where we actually are just allowed to authentically be ourselves. So, whether that means that we're hanging out sober or whether we're doing deep shadow work with psychedelics, but basically it's okay to be messy in these ways. It's okay to be authentic or goofy or vulnerable. We have like our patron saint of vulnerability, Brene Brown, ushering us into this new way of connecting more authentically. And so I think we don't need to numb out in the same way. We can hang out in a way that's really fulfilling and life affirming, completely sober. It just was harder when we were supposed to be cool and aloof and never earnest and never vulnerable. But we're moving past that.
I agree. I I probably drink a little bit more than you, but not very frequently. Probably like twice a month, maybe I'll
Mhm.
have like a glass of wine. Um, but not because I want the alcohol in those moments, but because I enjoy a good glass of wine
Right.
sometimes. Um, but yeah, it's definitely. I mean, I'm glad you brought up that it's a carcinogen, ethanol, and that it doesn't do our sleep any favors. Um, it's very unpredictable for me. Like I know that if I have a glass or two and then I sober up before bed, the odds of me waking up feeling any residual effects from it the next morning are pretty low
Mhm.
if I'm sober before I go to bed.
Yeah.
But if I go to bed even with the slightest hint of a buzz, um, even with like one drink, I can wake up the next morning with a headache. I think it creates like apneas.
Oh, yeah. Well, I wouldn't be shocked. This is not something I know, but I'm just gonna sort of go out on a limb and say I wouldn't be shocked if it impacts the way our sort of our musculature collapses, and that
Mm,
can pertain to all the different
I think you're right.
like obstructive sleep apnea is so epidemic right now, and I'm so fascinated by that. I think there's a lot that goes into that. There's a lot that goes into that. One thing that I'm really keen about is like the way that multi generations of inadequate nutrition are changing our jaw structure. They're
Mm,
changing how we build our dental arches and our jaw formation. And so we just don't have these patent open airways that allow for adequate through the nose breathing while we sleep, that allows for adequate oxygenation of our brains. So I wouldn't be shocked if alcohol just further contributes to sort of the collapse of the airways and making it that much more resistance and we're not breathing as well overnight. And like, yeah, if you could focus on only one thing to improve your mental health, it's going to be protecting the quality of your sleep. And, I think alcohol can throw that on the pile as one more thing. We think of it as like, oh, have a nightcap. It helps you fall asleep. Sure, it does help you fall asleep. This is true. But net, like it ends up impacting the quality of your sleep so much negative that fact that it made it easier to fall asleep is more than offset.
yeah. Two of my favorite sleep hacks are one is mouth taping. So
Yeah.
I'll tape my mouth
Yeah.
closed. And then another one are those breathe right strips
Hmm.
that open up your nasal airways.
Yeah.
I think those are great. I actually also I know a lot of people who are in the functional movement space, um, maybe rehab therapists. There's this notion that sleeping on your stomach is not good for your back, but it's actually prone. Sleeping in the prone position on your stomach is great for breathing.
Hmm.
It reduces the load on your respiratory system
That's
and your
interesting.
cardiovascular system.
It
And also I think it helps reduce apnea. So I sleep on my stomach, and it makes me. I feel like it makes me breathe a lot easier. You just have to find a way to prop yourself up. I sleep with like two pillows on my side. Also, I'm kind of like I'm almost like religious about my like sleep routine. But you want to prop yourself in a way that doesn't cause your neck to kink.
yeah,
Obviously, when you're sleeping
yeah.
on your stomach, but if you're able to do that, um, I think it's really good for enhancing oxygenation as you sleep.
Take a moment to be grateful just to be alive in 2022 and not like, I mean, how did they do it on the proverbial savannah? Like they
Yeah.
didn't have the way to make the properly, this
Yeah.
pillow situation so you're on your stomach, but you're not kinking your neck. Yeah, the back position. I mean, most people just know this and have a personal connection to it. Like when my husband starts snoring, I just sort of like, without waking him up, just tilt him onto his side, and
Oh
then the
God.
snoring has gone away. Yeah.
Snoring, man. Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I'm sure it's better for your back to sleep on your back, but I don't know. I think with the right pillow propping, you can actually make it very good for your back to sleep on your stomach. You just have to kind of know how to do it.
Yeah. And
Um,
I'm a convert to what I believe is called functional manual therapy. It's a sort of branch of physical therapy. And people who are almost taking like the functional medicine approach to medicine, root cause resolution rather than symptom suppression, they're looking at the body in this way. And it's like, well, in what way are you sitting or sleeping, or like how is your jaw developed? That's having all these downstream consequences for the rest of your body. And so I'm working with a functional manual therapist right now. He's widening my palate
wow.
so that I can breathe better.
Wait, how does he do that?
It's excruciatingly painful,
With his fingers,
with
like
his
manual
fingers.
manipulation?
Yeah.
Can you achieve that with just like finger manipulation?
I already noticed a difference, and I'm
Wow.
working with him since maybe about 6 months. Yeah.
Interesting. I'd be down to explore that. When I was a kid, I had braces, and the first part of the orthodontic whatever that they did was wore a palate expander,
Yeah.
which was torture. But I wonder if that's yeah. I mean, narrow palates, I'm sure, is a symptom of lack of fat soluble vitamins, breastfeeding, all that stuff.
Breastfeeding is certainly a factor, like all the different what you're sucking on as a baby. I think also as kids start to eat solid foods, like you actually want them like gnawing the meat off the bone. You want them to
Mm,
do things that we evolved doing that's effortful for the jaw. It's like
interesting.
rather than all the soft processed foods of modernity, if you're
Wow.
having peanut butter jelly sandwiches and like snack packs from their, middle aisles of the grocery store, you're not doing any challenge to your jaw. It's just like, any kind of muscle building. And you're developing a jaw. You want to give it that tactile feedback so it can develop strong. And then I think all the things that are contributing to mouth breathing, and that can be, mold and dust mites and dietary intolerances and dysbiosis even indirectly contributes. So all the things we're doing that just make us more congested and unable to breathe through our nose then creates this facial structure where we're sort of like elongating because we're not holding the mouth closed, we're not bringing the tongue to the hard palate. So we're holding this position, and then we develop that way.
Wow.
Mm.
So much to consider. It's like, our bodies are tasked with now having to not just survive, but ideally thrive in a world that is so far removed from that in which our ancestors evolved. Our bodies evolved. It's
Yeah.
just, it's crazy.
Yeah, and I think that it's where it's interesting just to bring this back to anxiety a little bit. Like we have our life naturals. People are just like, "What? Life is easy, no big deal." And that's fine. That's great. We need those people. Like be our pilots, be our surgeons. We need you life naturals. But the anxious folk are really here to help be our canaries in the coal mine and to help clue the rest of us into the fact that this modern world is making them sick. And, we sort of have a culture right now that shames them, sort of says, like, you're so sensitive, or like, why do you have your dietary restrictions? And it's sort of like this shaming of being sensitive in that way. But I really think we owe a debt of gratitude to people who are sensitive to the modern world because they're cluing us in to what's poisoning us. And if you're a life natural, it doesn't hurt to do some of the habits that you see your sensitive, anxious friends do because they're onto something. But anxious people have basically they're navigating this modern world and being like, okay, what foods can I tolerate? What do I have to do to improve my sleep? How do I need to reconnect to some kind of spirituality? How do I get psychospiritually at peace and in balance. And so they're really pioneers. They're blazing that trail through modern life. And so, if you are anxious, I think it's so important to not just pathologize that and say, like, this is something that's wrong with me. It's my genetic inheritance. It's my destiny. I need medication for it. Maybe you do. Maybe that's helpful. But you can see this as both a communication from the wisdom of your body saying, well, here's, somehow this combination isn't working for us. Can we get back into balance? And in many ways, it's sort of this superpower. It's an enhanced sensitivity, and it's sensitive in every sense of the word. So you might be more sensitive to gluten and more sensitive to like loud noises or weird textures, but you're probably also more attuned to other people's needs. You're probably a little bit more intuitive. So I say embrace it, and yeah, and don't necessarily have a negative attitude towards it. But importantly, if you're suffering from it, if it's creating all kinds of challenge in your life, start first with everything we talked about that's physiologic. It's what I call false anxiety. It's this avoidable anxiety. It doesn't have to be happening. And you can basically go through that list. Like, is it blood sugar? Is it sleep deprivation? Is it alcohol? Am I inflamed? Is something off in my gut? Am I micronutrient deficiency? What's going on with my thyroid? You want to just do a survey of all the physical impacts that might be getting things out of balance and contributing to a stress response. And then once you kind of do away with that, you'll be less anxious in your life. That's the false anxiety. It's avoidable. We don't need to have it. And then that leaves behind, like, what remains is our true anxiety. And that's not something to try to medicate away. It's certainly not something to pathologize. It's really something to slow down and listen to and honor, heed.
Wow, I love that. And you have that list in your book, The Anatomy of Anxiety, correct? So
Correct.
how people can better take inventory of their feelings and assess what is false, what is true, and where to go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. My patients, I often have them just like write it down on a list, put it on their refrigerator. Because when you're
Wow.
in the moment, you don't always have the presence of mind to be like, oh, is this my blood sugar? You kind
Hmm.
of just need to refer back to the list and be like, oh, yeah.
Yeah, because in the moment, it's like the fog of war. You
Yeah.
don't have those faculties necessarily at arm's reach.
Right. Yeah. You're seeing things through that sort of stress response tinted lens.
Wow. Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
Some might call it a near-death experience. Basically, I lost consciousness. And when I came to, I was in an emergency room. That was kind of the beginning of a very dramatic beginning to chronic fatigue syndrome, chronic vertigo with dysautonomia, which is when the autonomic nervous system is very uncoordinated. So,
How does that manifest when the autonomic? Because I mean, when I think of the autonomic nervous system, I think of the sympathetic and the parasympathetic,
yes,
sort of
yeah.
a yin and yang aspect to the nervous system. So, how does that manifest in terms of like how you were feeling?
Yeah, it can manifest in a lot of different ways. I forget now how many different forms of dysautonomia there are, but I think 6 or 7, something like that.
Wow.
The most well-known one is called POTS, postural orthostatic tachycardic syndrome, which is, I hear it all the time now. It's very prevalent, especially emerging in young women.
Mm.
So, but always feeling like you're kind of on the verge of passing out. For me, a lot of it was vertigo. Racing heart, sitting down, feeling calm, and suddenly the heart rate shoots up. As you well know, it affects the brain, it affects digestion, breathing rate. So it's just this lived sense of having absolutely no control. You feel a lot like you're at the mercy of whatever the nervous system is going to do. So that together with the real severe exhaustion of chronic fatigue syndrome, flu-like exhaustion, kept me housebound actually for the next, almost decade. And I should also mention that part of this very dramatic episode in Beijing was also the beginning of my second pregnancy. So there was this. There was, again, a huge flux in hormones, right, which was happening. Again, in hindsight, having later on gone into integrative and functional medicine and really trying to understand root causes, probably right, I had pre-existing autoimmunity that wasn't resolved. I go into a second pregnancy, huge shift in hormones. I did have some kind of gastrointestinal virus. And I know that because my husband and my daughter had it too. And then, so we had the infection, and then also probably just lots of pollutants being in Beijing. So kind of that perfect storm was the beginning of this next leg of my journey.
It's fascinating and shocking at the same time. I mean, I think a lot of people would assume that somebody as highly credentialed as you wouldn't be subjected to the same kind of fog of war that chronic illness presents with, because you have all this training and knowledge under your belt. But when dealing with these kinds of illnesses, it sounds like you were just as mystified as anybody else would be.
Oh, I was just as mystified. And, I have to say, Max, I mean, it was incredibly humbling because, somewhere in my psyche, I felt like I was immune, not even so much because of the knowledge that I had, but that somehow the knowledge, not that the knowledge would get me out of it. It was that somehow the knowledge was going to protect me. Like I'm on this side of the bedside, right? And my patients are on the other side. So there was a sense of immunity. I mean, literally, kind of pun intended, a real immunity to it. It was humbling to be suddenly a patient that, Western medicine, that my own paradigm had no answers for, but also the stigma that goes along with it as well. And the stigma was, of being a difficult patient, of, was this some, was I somaticizing? Was it anxiety? Was it depression? And sure, I had anxiety, and sure, I had depression. And I also knew that there was something deeper. So I could see in the doctors I was consulting, I could see in their eyes the judgment, this isn't really going on. But I also had that towards myself. And I think that that's what was hard for me. It's not like that. Of course, everyone has their own journey. I know other doctor patients who didn't go into that place of severe self, criticism and judgment. But I just, I had that mentality, like I just need to put my mind over matter and push past this. And I could not. So it took me, a couple of years of just really running into a wall and suffering enough to say, oh, you know what, maybe I got to step out of this paradigm. And I couldn't even see beyond it, right? That paradigm was my whole worldview. It wasn't just medicine. That's how I really interfaced with the world. So it was not an enlightening moment for me. It was one of real desperation. So I was too tired to hold on, and I, kind of was forced to surrender and to try differently.
Wow. So then what were some of those early steps that you began to take when trying to see what was behind the veil? If the Western paradigm ceased to provide you, or was unable to provide you with the answers that you sought?
Yeah, I mean, my very first step was again, I mean, I was very much leading with my mind. So, and that was how I had to do it. It had to make sense to me. I was cracking open my Pathology 101 textbook and trying to understand how does disease happen, right? So if you have, this was even before I had like the diagnoses officially of dysautonomia and chronic fatigue syndrome, and even after that, it's like you're still in this sort of, never land in between, right? Sort of what to do and what not to do. Like nobody knows. And so I just went back to basics and trying to understand how disease happens. And also in that process, understanding that we actually knew very little about health and what healing was. So that, and I think the aha moment for me was, with these diagnoses and even without the diagnoses, the chronicity and the poor prognoses of these kinds of conditions can be very, very self-defeating, right? It's like you look at the stats and the vast majority of people with these syndromes don't recover or live a significantly limited life. That kind of becomes, again, your framework. So one of the things I first did was I did as much as I could to detach from that identity. Like that's not who I am. I'm a human being, right, with some imbalances. And so the Pathology 101 really helped me see that. And it's not black and white. Diagnoses are not, right? It's a continuum. So, even something as black and what we think in terms of like black and white, like cancer, right? It's still a continuum, right? We've got these cancer cells, our immune system's keeping it in surveillance and keeping things in check. But at the point at which we can diagnose, we kind of say that you officially have disease. And so going into the mechanisms of disease and looking at, there are causes to this, I began to sort of one by one dive into what those causes might be for me.
Wow, it's fascinating. Yeah, I mean, a diagnosis, obviously it's great when you're able to attain a diagnosis, but it can also provide a false sense of security, because diagnoses don't say anything about the root cause of a condition. And so I can't even imagine what your frustration must have been like. But then, so when it comes to the root cause, you mentioned that you had gotten turned on to this concept, functional medicine. What is that all about?
Functional medicine, I mean, it was something I kind of stumbled into later when I was ready to go back into clinical medicine. I had to take a leave from work. I took a leave from work for about 3 years or so and went back very part-time. But when I was ready, my kids were a little bit older, I was ready to actually apply what I had been learning on my journey to patient care. And I had no idea what that looked like, because mine was like, I was stumbling around, trial and error and, on diet, like going a little bit into ancestral health. And then coming across gluten and its connection and dairy with the thyroid. Okay, so I got to do that. It was very piecemeal. And so I began to explore different paradigms of integrative health. And I was shadowing different doctors. And one of the doctors I shadowed was an integrative, a holistic pediatrician in San Francisco. And I said, well, I'm really looking for integrative, something integrative. Acupuncture had been a very big part of my healing journey as well as in the beginning. And from my acupuncturist, I learned about the importance of digestion, of gut health, just kind of being that foundational piece. And also how the gut connects to the mother, and to nourishment and to the land. And so I was very interested in this ecological paradigm, this paradigm that was much bigger than even myself. And how do I relate to my community? How do I relate to nature, to, global health? And I was explaining this to this pediatrician, and she said, God, it sounds like you're really interested in functional medicine. So that was my intro to it. And it just happened that the Institute for Functional Medicine was putting on their foundational course the next month. And it was in Santa Monica. And that was, traveling had always been difficult for me since all this happened. And that was doable. It was just a short hop down from Northern California. And so that was my introduction. And functional medicine, I still don't think it's a great term because nobody knows what it is. But it's really root cause medicine. And maybe we can call it, the body as an ecosystem medicine. I don't know what we would call it, but really looking at us as one system that's dynamic and not just within ourselves, but in dynamic flux with all our entire cumulative environment, and understanding how stress, right, the different causes of disease. So, there's generally like 5 classes of causes of disease, right? So there's infections, allergens, inflammatory foods, toxins or pollutants, and stress. So emotional, mental, physical stress. But how do they play through our genetics and then express as a unique disease or a unique set of symptoms? And so it's, it brought me suddenly from very limited tools, right, in my doctor's bag, to something that was beautiful. It was complex. but it was also seemingly infinite in its possibilities, in its different iterations, right? You talk with, I mean, you talk to all these experts, and they're going to argue, what is the best diet, and what is the best way to, to move, to exercise the body. What is the, I mean, and I was both enlightened and I felt incredibly confused, both as a patient who was trying to navigate, what do I need to do next? This protocol is not working, so what do I do? To what do I offer my patients? Because it was also seemingly infinite in terms of the different possibilities. So that actually led me into very reluctantly, but again, like necessity, right? Desperation just kind of breaks down doors. I moved on into, or not didn't move on to, I added and brought into my my life intuition and intuitive medicine. And how do we begin to marry, right? I mean, healing is balancing, right? It's really balancing. How do we begin to balance the right side of the brain, which is so underutilized, I think, in medicine as a whole, with the left brain? And really, I see it as having two eyes, right? We have two to see deeper and to see wider. And so two sides of the brain, can we see what is true, like in front of us, with much more clarity? So I just began, learning that intuition is like music or art. It's, some people are born gifted. Some of us are born tone deaf, and doesn't matter. Wherever we start, we can we can practice and we can improve. So, so it was it was very much an intentional, after I was kind of forced into it, because I wanted to understand how to narrow down the possibilities of treatments. It became very intentional. Like, I want to develop this.
I love this concept of intuitive medicine, and I want to definitely unpack it some more, but I do want to take a step back, because I think, when we started talking about functional medicine, I do want to know about, before having discovered this concept, what were some of the things that you were learning about diet and lifestyle that helped you get the symptoms that you were bring the symptoms that you were experiencing under control?
Yeah, so I would say, like, one of the first things was actually sleep, right? Because sleep was a real challenge, and I was like, if I can't get regular sleep or more sleep or better quality sleep, then I'm not even going to have the energy to do anything else. One of the things that I learned, I knew a lot. I had, of course, already been doing like a lot of sleep hygiene. I hadn't had caffeine in I don't know how many years. It was whatever, dimming the lights down, soothing music, relaxation, all that, baths, to no avail. And I began learning about the circadian rhythm. And how actually what I did and how my body and my mind worked during the day were going to affect what was happening at night. And again, it seems so fundamental right now and so obvious, but in medicine, and I think just me as a human being, everything is very myopic, right? And if I had a symptom, I'd be like, what caused that? And I would just kind of look in the last, 10 minutes, last hour, maybe last half day, what must have caused that? And very often it's not that way, right? The body's responding to a whole set of different things that have happened in different layers at different times. So I began to, I need to align my body and my mind with rhythms during the day. And my relaxation stuff needs to start at the beginning of the day so that I, kind of move through my day in a different way. It began to teach me to, one of the things I dove into was Qigong, which is a moving meditation, sometimes called embodied consciousness practices, but it's the foundation of Tai Chi, martial arts, traditional Chinese medicine. It is, and it's the thing with Qigong is you don't even need a yoga mat, you don't need a yoga block, you don't need any props, period. And every movement can be modified. So if I was doing it from the couch, I was doing it from the couch. If I couldn't really get out of bed, I would do it from the bed.
It's actually great for Parkinson's disease.
Oh, it's incredible. It's incredible. And, and there have been, right, a lot of studies looking at the benefits, and there are a lot of theories about how it works, right? In terms of what's happening. Is it modulating genes? Is it changing the way the neurons are connecting? Is it dampening inflammation? It has a positive effect on the immune system. I mean, all of these things. And as I've now been practicing very deeply for almost 8 years now, and as I continue to go deeper, it is so much. There's so much more, even below the molecular level. And that's the place where I currently, we can jump to this later, but where I'm currently most interested, because that's where radical healing happens. And just as most things in life, right, it's our personal journeys that take us there. So I did have another health crisis that after which I experienced a radical healing. And so I began to go into what is that subtle energetic realm that might be able to make any healing, whether it's conventional medicine or integrated functional medicine, any healing much more efficient, much more, rapid. But going back to your question, so Qigong was one of the things that helped me kind of regulate my circadian rhythm. And through that, I also began to realize, I don't have to react all the time to every single symptom. I can observe it from a little bit of a distance, but it wasn't a detachment like what we tend to do is we dissociate from our bodies because it's really frightening, it's uncomfortable. Our consciousness goes way outside of ourselves. But Qigong gives us this paradigm to actually stay within our bodies, stay with the discomfort, but you can also observe the discomfort. And so, again, I think just a lot of the erratic patterns began to smooth over. The second thing that I learned on my journey when I was piecing things together was, as I mentioned earlier, I was seeing an acupuncturist. And that was also, with some, hoeing and hawing in the beginning, like, what are those needles going to do, And I had a really the first treatment I had was just like 4 tiny little needles. And I wanted more, right? I was like, no, I've been suffering a long time. I want some results. And 4 tiny little needles. And I had a major, major withdrawal reaction. I mean, I felt like I was detoxing from opioids. It was that intense. And so it scared me. It was frightening. And certainly my husband did not like that either. He's like, you are not going back to acupuncture. And when I spoke to some of my friends who knew about acupuncture, who'd been training in it, they said, that's a detox reaction. That's a chi reaction. And it's a healing reaction. So the thing that made me go back was something was happening, whereas nothing had happened, to anything else really I was trying. And it was through this acupuncturist that, he was feeling my pulse. He was telling me about my relationship with my mother, reading my, my abdominal pulse, my digestive pulse. And then he also said, you're really deficient, yin deficient, which is actually probably very most closely correlated with adrenal. My whole hormonal stress axis was deficient. And he said, what's your diet like? And this was, when I had been eating what I thought was a very healthy diet. But again, I didn't recognize sort of the one size doesn't fit all thing. I was largely organic by this point, mostly vegetables. And he said, you need a lot more meat. And it just really surprised me. He said, you need heavy foods. Like, don't do the salads. You need heavy foods, stews, soups, meaty. You know about bone broth? So it was like, and that was way before it was even, like a fad. I don't know if you can call it a fad now, but it's all over, at least Northern California. It's even in Texas. So that was the beginning of, I got to tailor this to myself, and I need to learn how to know what my body needs.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
I left healthcare because I didn't feel the solution for people existed within that paradigm. So the paradigm that I see the solution and that we've seen the most success with, the solution for people to fix their bodies lies in this is the wording, it's controlled movement, body awareness, moving in alignment, aligning your frames with your muscles, like connecting deeply to your body, and then using progressive exercises as a tool to gain that awareness and strength.